Hey, what's going on, everybody? Joel here with Catfish Combat. Today I'm going to do something a little different. I'm going to talk about fishing lines. So, the other kind of Catfish 101 videos I started with the catfish themselves, bodies of water. Now we're and then we talked about baits. Now I'm going to work my way backwards for hooks and lines, essentially, okay? So with that being said, we're going to go over the different types of lines that are available. I'm going to tell you what my personal opinion is of each one, and it's used for catfishing and certain situations where one line might be better than the other, and just kind of explore that a little bit. And then I'll talk about the hooks that I use as well. So we'll work our way backwards from the rig. It's kind of like backwards planning, right? Work from the fish all the way back to basically the rod and reel, the boat, everything like that, okay? So first thing we're going to talk about, the most common type of fishing line you'll see is monofilament. So I got a couple of different types of monofilament here. Now monofilament, it's a nylon line, and it's usually readily available and fairly cheap. That's one of the reasons a lot of people use it. This is Red Cajun line. This is Zebco Red Cajun. This is a Berkley Big Game Solar Collector. This is 40-pound test. Okay, this is what I use on all of my rods and reels for catfish. So monofilament, one of the advantages of it is it has some stretch to it. It is actually flexible. I can pull it right now. I can kind of feel it moving. That stretch can absorb some of the shock when a big catfish grabs a hold of the line, or when you're, the big trophy catfish right next to your boat and they're pulling. That stretch is a little bit of grace, okay? So it's a little bit of insurance. One of the reasons I like it. The other reason that mono's, one of the advantages of mono, it's very durable. It can take nicks and cuts and rubbing on rocks. You will see little nicks on it, but typically that doesn't reduce the strength of this a lot. It's usually still pretty strong, and it will hold its own. Big fan of this stuff, big fan of mono. And like I said, this stuff is cheap. This is the cheapest you can usually get out there between the three lines. This roll, I want to say this is about 330, 350 yards, something like that. I get this at Walmart for like $7, $8. And I mean, one roll of this will cover 2 of my reels, so that's pretty economical. I like this one a lot. Also, this is Berkley, like I said, not Berkley, this is Zebco Red Cajun line. This is 12-pound test. I've been really impressed with this line. I just put it on a couple of my reels. This stuff is really strong. Highly recommended. It's not all mono is made the same. I've had some really bad experience with other companies. I'm not going to mention them here. Just my personal experience. I've had really cheap lines that break. I've had American-made ones that break that everybody kind of swore by. Not a huge fan. So if I tell you what I'm using and what I like, it's because I've been through a lot of them and I've been unsatisfied with some of them. These are the ones I've settled on that have been proven to work for me. On all of my leaders, I use monofilament, and I definitely recommend that you do. Do not use Braid or anything else crazy on your leaders. So my leader I use, I get this stuff on Amazon. It's the only place I can find it. This is Berkley Big Game Trailing. This is 80-pound test. This is a 55-yard spool. I can get these on Amazon for about $7, $8. This will last me for months. But yeah, this is what I use on all of my leader material, everything from the end of the barrel swivel to the hook or anything else in between. This stuff, that leader is what's going to take the majority of your shock and what's going to take all the weight of the fish, especially when it's at the surface. So you need that to be very, very strong. That's why most people, they actually have a stronger line on their leader than they do in their reels. One of the other things you have to consider about the line that you're using is how much space this is going to take up on your reels. Mono, especially like 40-pound test like that, is really thick. So the diameter is going to take up more space in your reel, which means you're going to get less of it on a reel, okay? That is one of the disadvantages of mono. There's a couple of them. That's a big one, is that you don't get as much line with it. Another disadvantage you have with this is this stuff has what you could be referred to as memory. It means that if it's coiled up around something, it's going to twist a little bit. And so when you're casting out and your line's limp, it'll kind of have coils. That's kind of a pain, and that can cause a lot of tangles and a lot of problems. So that's one of the big, I would say that's probably the biggest disadvantage of mono, and it can be very frustrating dealing with that. One way to prevent it, that you can get rid of that, before you put mono on a reel, go ahead and soak this for a couple of days in a bowl of water. Take off that's why I don't have any of the decals or anything like that on my spools that I actually use. It's because I peel them off and I soak these in water for a couple of days, and it helps get a lot of that memory out. That's one of the ways you can do it. The next type of line we're going to talk about is fluorocarbon line. Fluorocarbon line is also a nylon line similar to mono, so it does have a little bit of stretch in it. Same advantage there with what you have with mono. This stuff has less memory on it than traditional mono, but the real big advantage of fluorocarbon, why people tend to use it a lot, especially with sight feeding fish or line shy fish, is that fluorocarbon, it's very hard to see in the water. Some companies will claim it's virtually invisible. Okay, yeah, that's their claim. But I will tell you that looking at this in the water, it is significantly less visible than most typical monofilaments. So that's one of the reasons people use it. So it has all of the advantages of mono and some of the disadvantages. The other big disadvantage with fluorocarbon is that it is quite expensive. It's about twice as much as your typical mono. So I don't use a lot. What most people use this for is when they're doing bass fishing or say walleye fishing, something like that, and they'll use a double uni knot to tie this to braid that they're using on their main line. They don't want to tie braid directly to their hook, so they'll have a leader in between. The only stuff I typically use this for, I used to do that. I used to use braid on some of my rigs, so I have this left over. I don't use it a lot, but I will use this on some of my catfish rigs, like if I'm doing, targeting 2 to 10 pound catfish, and I'm kind of doing bottom bouncing with lighter gear. This is a good option. This stuff's really strong. I've never had it break on me with a fish. But yeah, 20-pound test right here. And I believe this is Seagar. This is, you don't have a label on it, but this is Seagar line. Okay, the last line we're going to go over is braid. Now, braid is different from mono and fluorocarbon in that it's a microfiber. So what that means is that there's one of the lines and it's wrapped. There's another one wrapped around it. It's woven around it. Okay, that usually the tighter and the closer that is, the more quality, more dense the line is, and the stronger it typically is. Now, braid is very, very sensitive because it has no stretch. Like I'm pulling on this right now. I can feel it's not moving. It has zero stretch on it. Okay. The claim is that braid is stronger than mono because it's more tightly woven. I would say that's one of the advantages of it, but that's an advantage with a significant caveat, and I'll get to that in a second. The big advantages of braid is that the diameter of it is smaller for the pound test that it is. So what I mean by that is that this 40-pound mono compared in diameter to 40-pound braid, the 40-pound braid is significantly smaller in diameter. You can get some really, really large amounts of this stuff for a very high pound test on your reel. What I mean by that is you can put 65-pound braid on your reels, which is the equivalent in diameter, I believe. Don't quote me on this from memory. I believe that's the equivalent of 20-pound mono in diameter. So you can fit a lot more of this stuff on a reel. That's a huge advantage, okay? Now, let's go to, it's that and the sensitivity. Now, let's go to the disadvantages of this stuff. The big disadvantage of this stuff is expensive. This stuff is significantly more expensive than mono. The other big disadvantage, and this is why I will never use this stuff again for catfish. When this stuff gets nicked or frayed on rocks or sharp edges, it frays a lot and it significantly weakens the line. I will give you a little bit of story time. So when I lived in Kentucky, I put braid towards the end of my time there on most of my catfish rigs, where I was fishing on lakes with mud bottoms, not really a major problem, okay? Now I come to Alabama and start fishing the Tennessee River. The Tennessee River has more current, it has rocks, it has trees, it has a lot of abrasions in it. There was one day I was fishing towards the end of March 2021, and I hooked into a flathead catfish that I never saw. That fish I battled for close to an hour. I'm estimating it was probably 50, 60 plus pounds. It was a huge flathead. Just the way it fought, convinced the flathead, ate a piece of skipjack about the size of my hand. It was a very large chunk. That fish manhandled my rig and then snapped the line. And the reason he snapped the line was because, and I noticed while fighting this fish, that just coming out of my reel, as it was coming out towards me, I noticed a big gash in my line. And I knew that stuff was frayed, and I kept trying to get that line back in my reel, and that fish just took off, and I knew it was out there. And when he actually snapped the line, so it wasn't because, you know, oh, he was so big that he snapped it, it was because the line had an abrasion in it and was weak. I saw the line, he was kind of at the surface, I was dragging him, it was a heavy current day, and I saw right in the middle, that thing snapped like a bowstring, made that loud crack as it broke. Yeah, broke my heart. I had to sit down for about 10 minutes, contemplate my life decisions. But I got over it and ended up catching a 30-pound flathead, you know, 10 minutes later. But to this day, I will not put braid on my catfish rigs. Now, does that mean it's not good for you or for your situation? No, this is just my personal opinion. The reason I don't use it is not just because of that story. It's the body of water that I'm fishing. I'm fishing the Tennessee River. I'm fishing areas where there are a lot of rocks and obstacles and structure. My lines, especially in the river where there's current, I don't recommend using braid because you're going to hit things. You just are. Your debris is going to go by in heavy current. It's just going to hit your line. If you have mono, it's going to be able to sustain that. If you have braid, it's going to abrase it and it's going to break if you get a good fish. Now, catfishing where this might be appropriate would be if you're on a lake that doesn't have a lot of current or a lot of structure, you're on mud bottoms, you're in areas where you can, you know, lay your lines out there and there's not a lot of movement or pulling or them hitting things, and you're not drift fishing either. If that's the case, yeah, by all means, braid would probably work for you. But that's the reason I don't use it. So kind of to summarize there, what I like to use the Berkley Big Game 40-pound test solar collector on my lines with the Berkley Trilene 80-pound test leader. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about are hooks. I've got everything laid out in front of me here that I would typically use on a catfish rig. Okay, so your standard hook that most fishermen use for, you know, live baits or any type of bait is your standard J hook. You can see that up real close there. My fat finger's in the way. The J hook's point is pretty much straight up with a slight curve towards the actual spine of the hook, okay? Now, what's different with catfish hooks, you can see that large 10-aught hook there. This is called a circle hook. The circle hook, you can see instead of the point coming this way, it actually turns back towards the spine of the hook. Now, what the point of that is, when you have a typical J hook here and a fish bites it, you have to actually set the hook to jam that point and that barb into their mouth, okay, to get a good hook set. Now, the circle hook is different. The circle hook is built so that when the fish grabs it, tension from the line, rather than a sudden pull, meaning pressure, right? It actually turns the hook inside the fish's mouth and sets it in the corner of their mouth. That's why that hook point is actually pointed back towards it. And this works. It sounds kind of crazy. I want to say Luke Nichols from Catfish and Carp YouTube channel, he did a great demonstration of this where he actually put a hook inside of it. It was a dead white bass, and he actually demonstrated how these work on land, and it does work. It actually does stick it in the corner of their mouth. So that's why we use circle hooks, because you can actually, you know, throw your rod out there, put it in a rod holder, and when a fish grabs it, they pretty much set the hook on their own just from running. Like blue cats, when they run, they pretty much set the hook. However, typically when you just reel down, that's why we don't set the hook with catfish. Just reel down for a second if they're kind of nibbling on it, because what that does, it just tightens it up and makes sure the pressure actually gets in the corner of the mouth. They feel that, they run, and the hook is set. Okay, so that's the circle hook. Now the two that I typically use size-wise, I use the 10-aught Mustad Demon circle hook. This is the perfect circle hook. Really like these. I used to use the Gamakatsu 10-aught circle hooks, which actually, I'm sorry, this is an 8-aught. Similar in design as an octopus circle hook, just the eyelets going in another direction there. I was losing quite a few fish from, you know, they just weren't hooking up. I switched to these, and I would say my hookup percentage increased dramatically once I switched. The other rig I use if I'm doing smaller rigs or targeting smaller fish is it's about a 4-aught Mustad Demon circle hook. It's the same thing, perfect circle, same model, just 4-aught, 5-aught will work as well. But if you're going to go for smaller fish with smaller baits, use a smaller hook. The only reason you need to go to something like 8 or 10-aught is just the size of the baits you're using, just so you can get enough of the hook and the meat if you're using larger baits. Whereas your bite-sized baits, your little small chunks, I usually use these 4 to 5-aught circle hooks for. Okay, so that's going to wrap us up for this episode of Catfish Combat. Yeah, I hope it was helpful to you today to learn about the different types of fishing lines and the different types of hooks. Again, this is all my opinion, just based on experience and trial and error, finding out what works for me and what doesn't, what's given me success and what hasn't. So if you like this kind of content, go ahead and hit like and subscribe, leave me a comment, and otherwise, stay on mission for him. God bless, and have a good day.